Hi, everyone. I'm Monty Solberg. I'm the CEO of New West Public Affairs, and welcome to the Budget 2022 New West Public Affairs webinar. It's been an absolutely crazy year since the last time that we did this. We, of course, have had waves of COVID-19, COVID restrictions coming on, COVID restrictions coming off. We had the federal Emergencies Act, trucker convoys, and of course now we have war breaking out between Russia and Ukraine, which surprisingly does have an impact on us in Alberta. And as amazing as it may seem, we today saw Alberta's Finance Minister Travis Toews announce a balanced budget for Alberta, something that was unthinkable 18 months ago when we were experiencing negative oil prices. And at the time, I think the general consensus was that we wouldn't see a balanced budget for many, many years, but here we are. Now, obviously, this surplus is very good news for Premier Kenney, but I think one of the big questions is it enough good news to help him overcome some of his political and economic problems? To help us sort through all of that, we have members of the New West team here, Matt Solberg, Sonia Kant, and Keith McLaughlin. But first, our very good friend and collaborator, Janet Brown of Janet Brown Opinion Research is with us. And Janet, you have your fingers on the pulse of Alberta, and you can give us a little context. So where is the government of Alberta at these days in terms of public opinion and public support? And how do you anticipate Budget 2022 will play out with Albertans?
Well, let's go way back to when this government was elected. So it was elected with a huge majority, 55% support. And as a government, it remained very popular for a year. It enjoyed a nice long honeymoon. And this government remained popular right up until the end of 2019. But then things started to slip for the government. The launch of the war room, the rail blockades, the cancellation of the Tech Frontier mining project, those things really sort of hit the government's reputation and it started to slide. And then once we hit COVID, it was just sort of a downward trend. And the government just kind of slid right down to, quite frankly, the most abysmal numbers that I've ever seen in Alberta politics. And you know, I've been doing this since literally the Don Getty days. So, you know, the government just really slipped into a very abysmal position. Now it has rebounded a bit, and now the government's prospects are nearly dismal, no longer abysmal. But still, I mean, this government is in dire straits, and I'm not going to make any predictions in 2023. But if Jason Kenney can turn this around and pull it off, it will be the biggest come from behind ever. But after today's budget, you know, I was listening to Trevor Tombe on the radio, and Trevor says this is the biggest turnaround we've seen in a budget ever. So, I mean, if this is the decade for turnarounds, then maybe this budget is you know, foretelling something. So as you said, Monty, like who would have thought a year ago we could be in a balanced position? Now there's a $500 million surplus, and the government's talking about surpluses for the next 3 years, and they've used $70 as their price for oil. So, you know, it doesn't sound like they're blowing smoke when they say a surplus. So for this embattled government, this budget is going to be good news. It's going to be seen as good news. The only clouds I see around it is I think a lot of just average people were hoping for some relief with their utility bills. So high oil prices give us a surplus, but they also, on a personal level, really sting when it comes to utilities. So I think some people were counting on some sort of utility rebate. It sounds like if we get something, it's not going to be till next year, and the threshold is quite high for that.
So, you know, I'm very curious to know, Janet, you know, people have been sort of stuck with COVID for 2 years. You know, that's been front and center with Albertans. It's all we talk about. I know you see it in your polling. Now that we're nearing the end, we hope, of COVID, where would, a balanced budget rank with Albertans? Like, is it a high priority? Is it something that they are now, because of the changing circumstances and getting rid of COVID, we hope, are they going to say, this is great news, we're excited about the future, this is optimistic? How do you read this?
Well, the last election, it was all about jobs, economy, pipelines. Like I remember Matt sending you some data as soon as the slogan came out for Kenny's campaign. I said, has Kenny been eavesdropping on my focus groups? Because those are the exact words people would use to say what they wanted government to focus on. So, the last election was about jobs, economy, pipelines. That's why we got this huge UCP government. But in 2015, people were very preoccupied with health and education. That's why we got an NDP majority government. Now today, people are very concerned about the economy. They're very concerned on getting things back on track after COVID, but they're also very concerned about getting our healthcare system back on track. And let's not forget about education. Primary, secondary, post-secondary. We've got kids who are going to have really suffered because of these crazy 2 years. And so parents and students are going to be looking for, what the government can do to help, make up for the turmoil and many of the setbacks that these students have faced. So we're in a position right now where Albertans have so many concerns. The budget's going to be good news, but it in and of itself is not going to be enough. And I'm going to throw another thing out there. I know the Kenny people have just been desperate to get some good economic news so they can change the channel. But you know what? If this news seems too good, if it just seems like the economy is going to, just run smoothly no matter what we do, then we can elect anybody. We don't need to elect a good economic steward. So good economic news can play well for this government, but it may also make people sort of say like, well, we're good. Let's vote. Let's think about healthcare and education when we vote.
Let's bring in some of the rest of the team here. Matt Solberg. Matt's in Edmonton. His ear close to the ground, right near the legislature. Matt, what's your take on the budget?
I think it was, objectively a good news budget. We're heading towards, or we're in a surplus position, a fairly sizable one, and in the sort of the outer years of this budget, will remain in that spot. I think it's going to be politically helpful for the premier. I also think it's a bit of a shot of optimism for a province that has, not just throughout COVID, but for many years before that, been in a bit of a tough spot, and I think this will help. I do think that there are going to be challenges, though, with this budget, and the idea that recovery is well underway. We didn't expect that with $100 oil that all of a sudden the UCP would become spendthrift, but they do need to make sure that that people actually feel the recovery themselves. And I know that there are things in the budget to help do that. Some of it, around skilling initiatives to help people retrain who may have been out of work for some time. And then, of course, the investments in health and education. I think those are all good. But if this is going to be a turnaround, if this is a turning point for this government, I think that the decisions that come from this budget in terms of what specifically, what kind of programs and projects this government will support, I think that will be important to a province that's really looking to feel that good news and really believe that we are on course for some brighter days.
So, Keith, what's your take on this? You've been around Alberta politics for a good while. You've been in government. How do you see this?
It's a headline budget for the government in the sense that they're getting the headline that they want, which is the surplus. But outside of the surplus, there isn't that much there here. There are increases to healthcare spending and education and PSE, but they're quite small, well below the rate of inflation. And there's some targeted spending programs on economic diversification activities. Excuse me. So there's outside of that surplus, there isn't a lot here, but it's a very political budget in that sense. This is about setting up the premier for his leadership review on April 9th, ensuring that they have met this goal, and a bit early than they expected to when you even look back to the last campaign, and setting up for 2023. I think, there's not a lot of goodies in this budget. I think that's in the next budget when you see the campaign, which will be a campaign budget next February. You will see these either increased spending or tax reductions from the UCP as a offering to the public moving forward. But this is definitely exactly the comeback play that the Premier needed at this point in time. Because as Janet was outlining, this government has been down in dismal poll numbers for some time. And this has always been the trajectory that the Premier needed for basically the past 15 months, which is an economic rebound and to say, look, our plan is working, and now and then up the threat of the NDP and say that you can't go back to the way it was in 2015 to 2019 when the oil price shock hit. And try to kind of play up on that aspect of things. So it's a good day for the Premier and a good day for the government, but there's a lot of other issues, as Janet alluded to as well.
Sonia, what's your take?
Thanks, Monty. I think compared to the last two budgets we've had, of course, they were in pandemic years, this is a pretty good budget for Premier Kenney. And we may have all noticed that he's really removed COVID-19 from this. This budget is really about growth, is really about economic growth in Alberta, kind of being having the fastest growth in the country, having the lowest taxes. And a lot of this is, of course, appeals to the base. It's a bread and butter. I think moving forward, it will certainly help Premier Kenney towards April 9th. I'm sure he'll be going around the province in the coming months to different areas of the province, discussing the big infrastructure spending he announced in this budget, including hospitals in central and northern Alberta. And I think, to Keith's point, this is a budget that will really, really set the stage for the platform development that the UCP will be looking forward to of this fall when they have their annual AGM, and it will set the stage for the 2023 election. I think there's a lot of good for Premier Kenney to go out and talk to not just his base, but most Albertans in this province. And there's little, I think, for former Premier and NDP opposition leader Rachel Notley to be critical of.
I think the point about the base is really important in this April 9th review. Clearly, everything that governments do is partly about politics, and that's certainly the case with this budget. But again, I'm just curious to know where, in your mind, Sonia, as somebody who's very close to rank and file UCP's supporters, where does a balanced budget rank with them in importance? Or is it more about getting the economy moving again and making sure that real people can feel the impact of a growing economy?
Right, great question, Monty. I think if you asked me this question 2 years ago when the government first got in, it would have been kind of a top 3 priority for the UCP base. I think right now it's probably 5th or 6th right now. I think what most of his base are concerned about is economic recovery. It's about healthcare capacity. If you look at some of rural Alberta, majority of voters who voted for the UCP and Kenney, they've really struggled with healthcare capacity and having access to hospitals, especially during COVID. I think the UCP base will also be happy to see some of the focus on diversification, which Premier Kenney has really pushed over the years. So I think it's a balanced budget is not where it used to be on the list of priorities. It's still very important, and it's something that Premier Kenney can go out and say he's accomplished that.
So we've had a question come in. I just want to see if I can address it. Somebody's asked where did these revenues come from that allowed the government to balance the budget? And the government's arguing 3 things. One, they're arguing that resource revenues have, of course, gone up substantially. And Trevor Tome, who Janet mentioned just a minute ago, estimates that for every $1 increase in the average price of oil over and above projections, it brings in $284 million more dollars to the government of Alberta. Right now, today, oil is at $93 a barrel. The projection for this year, this fiscal year, was $70.50. So, you can see the potential for things to go up a lot. There's also some modest fiscal restraint. The finance minister argued that they kept spending fairly restrained under the rate of inflation and population growth. And then the other area where they're bringing in more revenues, corporate taxes and personal income taxes, as economic activity heats up. Keith, you have something you'd like to add?
Just quickly, Monty, I just wanted to add the numbers to this. It is predominantly natural resource revenues. I was looking up the fiscal table after Maureen's question. For instance, last budget, bitumen and other natural resource royalties were pegged at $2.7 billion in revenue for the government of Alberta last year. The government collected over $13.2 billion is what they are now forecasting as last year's natural resource revenues. So that is the predominant reason of why we are in surplus.
All right. Any other comments or thoughts on the overall budget, the politics around it? Anything anybody wants to add?
Well, I would just add, in terms of the amount of revenue and stuff, we've always known we lived in a boom and bust province, but I think Albertans were starting to think that that cycle had ended, right? And you look at these numbers and what a big turnaround it is, and it kind of reminds you of the old bumper sticker, Lord, give me another boom, and I promise not to squander it. I'm paraphrasing there.
Yeah, something like that.
So this is like really good news, but I hear a lot of people talking about this as the last boom, right? Like, we didn't think we'd get another one. And so there's going to be a lot of talk about how we manage this. And Keith sort of hinted at this. What's the responsible thing to do with this short-term unexpected windfall? How do we rethink our, finances? Because we should never, ever count on, this kind of a windfall again.
We should never count on it, but we should never discount it again. And I think a lot of people did discount it after, we went to negative oil prices, and people felt like the oil and gas era was completely over. And now with this, with the war, of course, going on in Eastern Europe, a lot of people are saying maybe we need to rethink, making sure that not just Canadians and North Americans, but the world has access to Canadian oil and gas. But that's a discussion for another day. It is important to point out, though, how mercurial the revenue projections can be when it comes to oil and gas. They can, when they do drop, and they will drop, the same thing applies in terms of revenues. For every dollar that goes down, there goes $284 million in revenue to the government of Canada, the government of Alberta. Fortunes can turn very quickly. Let's move on here. Like, there's some big winners in this, obviously, today. There's significant winners. Healthcare spending. Certain hospitals are going to benefit tremendously by this. Of course, this is interesting public policy, but it's also interesting politics. Why don't we talk a little bit about all of that? Janet, you did mention right at the top that healthcare is something that's on people's minds. How do we see this playing out with people who are concerned about healthcare? Travis Taves even quoted Heather Smith of the Alberta Nurses Association today. What do we think about the increase in spending? Matt, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think that the increase in spending on healthcare is not a surprise. And for about 6 months, frankly, ever since Minister Copping took over the role of health, the Premier has been very clear that they expect to see a sustained increase in healthcare capacity, and we're working to ensure that happens. Now, I think that the potential challenge that may come, and I'm not convinced that it will be one, is the kind of healthcare capacity that this government seems to be adding, which is as they've said, primarily going to be, third-party independent surgical providers, third-party continuing care operators and support. And we know that those kinds of decisions have incited some opposition from certainly labor groups, from the NDP in the past. But when you do have a backlog of surgeries, as long as not just Alberta has, but every single province in this country after COVID, the opposition is really going to need to bank on people caring whether or not their surgical provider is, wearing an AHS name tag or that of a third-party contractor. I'm not convinced they will. And in fact, I saw some polling, I think it was about last month, some nationwide polling that said due to the pandemic, Canadians by and large have dropped a lot of their sort of opposition to utilizing independent healthcare providers. So whether or not that holds true, we'll see. I think it's going to be in the best interest of this government's opponents to ensure that it does not hold true and that they find a way to raise the alarm on this. But I think that when there's $700 million set aside to tackle that backlog, I'm not convinced that it will be a political lightning rod the way it may have been in years past.
So Keith, what's your perspective on that?
I would actually agree with Matt on that. I think Albertans generally would like to see that backlog cleared. So I don't see healthcare. I see healthcare being an issue in the next election because there has been chaos in the system before COVID. And as I mentioned, the increases to healthcare are not in line with inflation, and healthcare costs generally increase higher than the rate of inflation. So I don't think we're out of the woods on the whole healthcare and education sort of issues for the government. And I think the other thing to just mention on some of this healthcare spending, yesterday there was a big announcement, or maybe it was the day before, $1.8 billion for a new hospital in Red Deer. Hospitals take time to complete, that they do, but the government actually only committed $193 million to that hospital over the next 3 years in the capital plan. That hospital is not going to be ready until 2031. So these are the types of things where there's a little bit of holes in some of these spending announcements where you dig into the deep details, and it may not be so glorious news for people that as they might seem through the headlines.
And if I could just say something on private surgical facilities, where this gets controversial is the word privatization. A lot of people jump to the assumption that that means two-tier user pay. And so the opposition is going to push that word privatize, and they're going to sort of get Albertans worried about the fact that they may need to pay for these things. But when an assured service is provided to an Albertan free of charge through a private facility, it's not a big concern to most Albertans. But the confusion comes if people are thinking this somehow is opening the door to two-tier. Who delivers it and who pays for it are two very different things, but opponents like to stir up that confusion.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it may be a bit of an insight into one of the election issues a year from now. Like, will this actually be one of the things that two leaders, whomever they are, end up fighting over to win the support of Albertans? Sonia, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did. Just to add on the healthcare topic we're all addressing here, I think what's really interesting in this budget from kind of the previous two, there is an emphasis on rural healthcare as well, beyond the Central Alberta Hospital and another one in Northern Alberta. I think there's a ribbon cutting soon on that. There's a lot of emphasis on getting and retaining the doctors. There was a big controversy over that. I think 2 years ago with the health minister. Now you put a new guy in, and they're going to spend, I think, about $5 million a year, Monty, on just retaining and training nurses and doctors in rural Alberta. So I think if you look at healthcare overall in this budget, I think it's gonna, maybe the dollar amount is not significant, but it will be significant for some regions of the province such as rural Alberta. And of course, that will lead to hopefully retaining some support for Premier Kenny and some of his MLAs going into the next election, and of course during nomination time.
Well, and of course, we should put this into a bit of a context. We're talking about the budget here, of course, but we just had the throne speech 2 days ago, where a lot of the big themes for the, for the government for the next year until the next election have been laid out. Healthcare was certainly prominent in the throne speech, and it's obviously going to be, one of these issues that gets rolled out slowly, and we'll get more details as we go. But I think the general impression I get, certainly talking to Janet, is that Albertans care a lot about this. They will want to have a government be responsive and to Keith's point, start to address these issues sooner rather than later. It's great to have a hospital in 2031, but of course, people want to know they can see a doctor when they need to see a doctor now. So we have a question that came in from Jim, our friend Jim, who we know quite well, and he's asking about the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and he's wondering if there's going to be any revenues. I think he asked if there's any of the surplus revenues are going to be going into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. There's no indication of that. I actually quickly just searched the budget documents. There is a big section on the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and it talks about the superior returns that it got last year, but that we should expect those returns to drop off a fair bit as market returns go back to normal. But I would just encourage Jim to have a look at that. Just control F6 and you'll find it, Jim, if you want to sort through that. So why don't we move on here? Speaking of the throne speech, we got some pretty good direction where the government's headed in the next little while. And I think we need to, take into account what the throne speech said when we're talking about budget 2022. We have to take into account things like the April 9th leadership review, and of course, the election coming up in 1 year's time, essentially 1 year's time. So given, the throne speech, what are we expecting the government to sort of lead with in the next little while, especially in the month ahead, in a way that will allow the Premier to say that he's getting things done for Albertans? They're feeling the impact. We've got all these different, rural Alberta in particular is sort of a target for the Premier these days. What in particular in the budget and the throne speech are going to resonate in rural Alberta? Sonia, I've got you in the middle of my screen right now. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. Well, there's a couple of things I noticed other than the hospital fundings happening in central and northern Alberta. There was another thing about injecting about $30 to $40 million a year on bringing doctors and retaining them in rural Alberta. That was a big problem in the past. It got a lot of rural MLAs in trouble. So I think Premier Kenny has learned his lesson from there. The government wants to make sure that that doesn't happen again, especially with aging population in those areas. It's a bit different than Calgary and Edmonton, which tend to have younger folks there. The other thing that matters to rural Alberta, of course, roads. It's a lot of them have been untouched. We saw that in the budget. There's a few highways announced by the Minister of Transportation, Rajaswani, on injecting some money into building the roads, and also, not just roads in rural Alberta, but also in Calgary and Edmonton as well with the ring roads. So I think what matters to rural Alberta is kind of healthcare capacity. They face with some issues in the past 2 years with the pandemic, and also with infrastructure like roads to kind of make sure that they move goods and etc.
All right. Anybody else want to jump in here?
Yeah, I guess I would say that one of the biggest issues for rural Alberta is I don't think it's unique to rural Alberta, and that's jobs. And I think that there are things within this budget that are designed to speak to those who have that top of mind. One of the pieces that I've just found here that I highlight is the the $41 million that the government has set aside specifically for the Alberta Energy Regulator, and that's to help create the sort of the regulatory frameworks to enable growth in geothermal and other these other sort of new resource industries that we see are already producing jobs in places like Drayton Valley and elsewhere. So if that goes well and those industries really take off, then I think that will go, I'd say, a long way to helping solve some of the political challenges that the premier has in rural Alberta. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to be the answer. We've seen that over the last 2 years. There's been a lot of different reasons for people to express dissent. Some of it's job related, some of it's been COVID related, and then everything in between. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
And if I could just add, like being a pollster in Alberta right now, it sometimes seems like, bizarro upside down world, because I see this government sort of taking positions that are counter to majority public opinion. And even more so in the throne speech than in the budget. We saw the premier again talking about stuff like an Alberta provincial police force, an Alberta pension plan. They talked about medical assistance in dying, but they use the inflammatory language of physician-assisted suicide. These are all things that touching the MAID program, policing, but these are not things that a majority of Albertans are keen on. So to see the premier continue to spend political capital on these things, it must mean to me that these are critical for the base, and he thinks it's critical to stay focused on these things ahead of April 9th.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Sorry, Monty, just to quickly jump off of Janet's points. And I think this might be a little realpolitik for the rural conservative base in Alberta. One element of it is populist, and it's been animated because of the COVID restrictions and very critical of the premier. There's another part of that rural conservative base that is a traditionally socially conservative base, which has been, an ally of the premier for a long time. And to Janet's points, some of the things we've heard in the throne speech and talking about expanded school choice and expanded choices for homeschooling and things like that. I think what you're seeing is ahead of April 9th, premier speaking to more of that social conservative element and more of these traditionally popular things with that traditional rural conservative base, trying to bring them back in and letting the kind of the COVID folks, the anti-COVID folks, which is winding down now. By April 9th, will be pretty much 5 weeks removed, because the premier is removing all restrictions basically on Saturday outside of like long-term care facilities. So I think that's what's going on.
Yeah. So a good point. And, there is a long list. I mean, if you go through the throne speech, there's probably a dozen very boutique-y type initiatives that the government announced that is clearly designed to appeal to the Conservative Party base, and that will undoubtedly help them. But in many cases, these things aren't, they're not big dollar things. They're a tip of the hat to people that he needs to have support him on April 9th. Let's move on here. Janet mentioned provincial police force, Alberta pension plan. There was mention, I think, of equalization, the equalization vote in the speech from the throne. None of that really reflected in the budget. Just thoughts on all of this from all of you. How heavy is the government going to be pushing this after April 9th? Is the premier going to be able to get through and then just sort of go ahead and pursue his message of hope, growth, and opportunity? And, we've got a brilliant economy ahead of us, and we're going to be attracting all kinds of jobs. Like, what is the sequence of communications for the premier starting, after today? Certainly they'll be selling the budget, but going forward, where do you see the government taking its message? And should we expect it'll be the three things that they mentioned in this budget, or are we going to see something different after April 9th?
Well, I guess I would say, between now and April 9th, the target audience is very, very different than what we will see after. And that is, the internal politics at play. Things like the, provincial pension program, provincial policing, equalization, the Fair Deal suite of ideas. Janet, I think is absolutely right in that every bit of research I've seen has shown that to the general public, they're not winning ideas. But when you go and talk to a lot of the base of support, the volunteers, the people that fund the party, and those who have come out to actually help this premier win an election in the past, those things do matter. And the absence of those in a throne speech or a budget right in advance of this leadership review, I think would spell some danger for this premier. And I expect that the rhetoric on sort of the bread and butter conservative issues for the next, well, I guess about 6 weeks will be quite hot. And what I think will be most interesting is, how does that jive with some of the longer term ambitions of the province? How do you square the lawsuit on the Emergency Act, for example, with the need for the federal government to come in and provide a whole bunch of supportive funding for CCUS? I don't necessarily think that they're incompatible. I think a lot of it's politics, and both the federal government and provincial government know that. But to the general public, it does seem like it is a bit of it doesn't quite make sense. So I think that, once April 10th comes, assuming that April 9th solves any of those issues, then I think the message will be much more targeted to the broader public, and how do we grow our voter universe as opposed to just speak to the base.
But this is the problem that conservatives across the country are facing, right? How do you keep the base in check, but have a message that's, open to a broader populace? And so certainly the premier is going to pivot after April 9th, but, he's partially in the problem he is right now, because, he was the guy in the blue pickup truck, signing the grassroots guarantee, and then the grassroots stopped believing that, right? So now he's trying to convince them, oh, no, I am the blue truck guy, I am the grassroots. He may be able to convince them of that a second time for the leadership, but every time you make a push to try and get the base under control, you may be just forfeiting your opportunity to win the next election with the general public.
And I'll just
right.
add.
Yeah, go ahead, Sonia, please.
Yeah, thanks, Monty. Thanks, Janet. Well, if you look at the kind of fair deal issues that Matt mentioned here, whether it was the Alberta pension plan, whether it was the Alberta police force, I mean, they've been consulting the public for a year and a half, maybe. It's been kind of on a hold-off pattern. I think the Alberta police force probably has the most realistic chance of probably achieving its goal in the next couple of years, perhaps even being on the party platform. But where you're going to see with these issues is there's your Calgary caucus, even one of your MLAs in Edmonton, they're going to have a problem with pushing this through, because in their ridings, having an Alberta police force or Alberta pension plan aren't popular ideas in their ridings, especially in Calgary, where it is going to be a battleground. I think if the premier does continue pushing that through the platform, and perhaps after April 10th, you're going to have a lot of his cabinet ministers, who are mostly in Calgary and the cities, kind of raise their hands and say, whoa, stop it. It's an issue that's controversial when we knock on doors, and it's going to cost my seat. So it's a really tricky thing for Premier Kenney to deal with. On one hand, he has to make his base happy. On the other hand, he has to make sure that all of his cabinet ministers based in Calgary win their seat in 2023.
It's a good point. There are sort of three big areas that every election pivots on: Edmonton, Calgary, and rural. And no doubt it's difficult balancing the three. And especially for the UCP, it really boils down to almost two, the way it's been going lately with the NDP vote so concentrated in Edmonton. Let's talk about winners and losers in the budget. We didn't see, at least so far, this is very much a hot take. We haven't seen many references to municipalities, for instance. Who wins and who loses in the budget? I know we haven't had a tremendous amount of time to go through the document yet, but any hot takes on who's coming off the best?
Well, if I can start, certainly none of us were in lockup. It takes days to go through, so we'll probably get a hint about some other controversial things in the days to come. But just off the top, I'd say who's the loser? Well, it's those people still suffering from shell shock from their last NMAX bill, who was kind of hoping they were going to get a check for $200 or $300. So the lack of rebates and also high energy prices. It's great for the province's fiscal situation, but it's also inflation. It's going to trigger inflation, and it's going to trigger a lot of sort of economic anxiety. So, the province has got to be careful that it's not taking too much of a victory lap on the macroeconomics, because we're in for a lot of pain on the microeconomics. These high energy prices are going to hit us in many, many ways. Groceries, fuel. Albertans are going to feel the pinch. We haven't felt it that badly in Alberta as other provinces, but I think if oil prices stay high, inflation is going to become a really important buzzword.
Anybody else?
I would just add, I think one of the things that I was a little bit surprised about, but not surprised now that we know how much the resource revenues improved, was how much little cutting there was. And so, like, when you talk about winners and losers, that I think why you don't see a whole bunch of folks coming out being like, this budget is fantastic, or folks coming out and saying this budget is a disaster, is because many folks have already taken their lumps. Municipalities, the healthcare sector, post-secondary. I think many folks are kind of happy that are funded by the government, the public sector, and other culture institutions, what have you, are happy that they aren't being cut, because there isn't a lot of deep cuts here either. There's like we talked about, there are increases, small ones, to healthcare, education, post-secondary, but there aren't deep cuts either. Municipalities aren't being whacked. There's new investments in some targeted capital infrastructure programs. So there's nothing to, I think, for folks in the public sector to be jumping up and down over. But there's nothing, well, in excitement or or being upset. So, I think in that way, again, the government's going to get the headline that it wants, that it's a surplus, and then let's see what's going to happen with that surplus as we move forward into 2023.
And I'll just add on that, in terms of winners, not to a specific group, but I think people that are newcomers to this province, or folks are going into trade school, I think they're the winners. The government mentioned the importance of skilled trades in their throne speech. They've been talking about that over the last 2 years. And in this budget, they've allocated, I think, $600 million to help with credentials, to help with people who speak English as their second language. They put in some money in post-secondary to kind of go towards the trade sector, including computer science. So I think if you're a new Albertan, or you're somebody looking for new employment, I think there's a good path for you in this budget. There's a lot of programs the government has emphasized with that $600 million over the next 2 years.
So if you're a rural UCP MLA and you're going back to the riding to sell this budget, can they be enthusiastic about what they've seen here? Like, is this going to, can they enthusiastically sell it? And secondly, and I guess it goes hand in glove, does this mean that some of them won't be nearly as critical of the premier as they were? Or in fact, maybe they'll even become fans? I don't know if they'll become fans, but where does this sit with UCP MLAs right now?
I think it gives them something that they can sell, certainly. I think that, as we've talked about, a lot of the most sort of vocal dissenters from the Premier's caucus came from rural Alberta, and I think there's enough in here for them to put in the window when talking to constituents. I think the balanced budget does help. Whether it's enough to sort of calm or not even just calm people, but bring them back into the fold, I think it's too early to tell, because I think a lot of that was based on what the public's reaction was to government. So if Janet goes into the field and comes out with a poll that shows this budget has been overwhelmingly popular with the public, then sure, absolutely, I think that's the single biggest motivator for a lot of those elected officials, which is, can I get reelected? Does this budget help me get reelected? I think it does, but I would want to see that confirmed with the general public, and that's where a lot of these MLAs are taking their cues from.
All right. Well, we're coming up we're getting close to the end of our time here. Is there any other issues that we should be talking about?
Well, the one sort of the one loser in this that I think is well, it seems fairly obvious now, is a PST, and those who were clamoring to maybe see one. I think that when we were forecasting an $18 billion deficit, and the only thing on the horizon seemed to be despair and unemployment, it made a lot more sense. But even then, I mean, Janet, again, you've done a bunch of research on this question over the years. I don't suspect that a budget like this adds to the merits of an argument for a PST. But Finance Minister Travis Taves did promise this year to strike an expert panel to examine the province's revenue mix. I don't know if there's going to be the same level of urgency in doing that this time around. But I will be curious to see how the other parties, the NDP certainly, position themselves on some of these revenue questions going into that next election.
And what I hear in my research is that, people say, before I give the government another revenue tool, I want the government to prove to me that they can do a better job on the spending side of things, right? There's still this perception that there's a lot of waste and that sort of thing, right? So yeah, with the fact that there's not a pressure on the revenue side at least for the foreseeable future, and that, yeah, this government sort of held the line on spending, but it doesn't look like it's going to, get very sort of fierce in its spending cuts. I just think that's sort of dead in the water. The promise of a review on revenues was when revenues were low. I can't imagine it's going to be a very fulsome, energetic conversation with these kind of resource revenue dollars coming in.
I just happened to glance at some news coverage just to see where the NDP are at, and former Premier Notley is saying, it's sleight of hand and creative writing, in the press release, et cetera, et cetera. Just, are they, what happens with the NDP on this? It sounds like it doesn't give them a lot to tee off on. I think that's fair to say. Is this sort of positive, negative, or neutral for them?
Well, I think Janet touched on an issue that this government has a few minutes ago, and that is a budget this rosy creates some believability issues. We know that those existed, with this government prior to this budget being tabled. So, I don't imagine the NDP have had a ton of time to dig into this either. Having worked in opposition before, you don't see the numbers before anyone else. So I think as sort of that top line message, I think it makes sense for them to poke some holes in it. But, maybe I can hand it over to Keith, who may have some more insight on this than I do.
Well, as for today, the NDP is not going to have an opportunity to win much of the messaging for today. So they should probably, they do need to do their thing and say their stuff, but I wouldn't press too hard on it and just let the government have its win. The real question is going forward. The economy is doing very, very well in Alberta. As predicted. The question is that enough? The government has had an issue with creating, let's just use the word chaos in healthcare and education. And Janet's already talked about the rise in consumer bills that are pressing families. If this economic recovery does not reach real families, and if the UCP does not provide relief to real families, the NDP can still offer something different, incredible. And as Janet said off the top, If it looks like the economy is going so well that it doesn't really matter who may be in charge, and then NDP may be offering something different that families can get behind, there's still something there, but that is not something that can be communicated today. I think this is a setup budget. It's going to be a very interesting next year and a bit, because by all traditional sort of metrics, this government should cruise to re-election, but they're still behind the NDP, probably about 10 points right now. Janet will tell us all next month, I'm sure, where the government actually stands on that. But it's going to be a very interesting year to see how the NDP will try to hold on to that lead and win an election against a resurgent UCP who is going to make these polls tighter, and an economy that looks like it's going to roar. But
good economic numbers are only good for the government if it translates into good jobs. And that's something we haven't seen right now. We're seeing a decent economy, but we're not seeing the recovery of jobs. So, if I were Kenny, I'd be focused on the economy. If I were Notley, I'd be focused on jobs.
Anya?
Yeah, just one kind of small micro issue. I've noticed over the last couple of years, especially when Premier Kenney first got in, you had the NDP up in the air talking about diversification, really pushing him to focus on other sectors. And I think that's something Rachel Notley and her caucus can't really be too critical of Kenney on that. He's done a tremendous job on several fronts, whether it was the natural gas strategy, the hydrogen, petrochem, with billions of dollars coming of new investments. I think that's an issue that I think most people thought the NDP had in hand. It was kind of on their sleeve. They always push that, but now Jason Kenney's got it, and he's got some good results on that. And I think over the next couple of months, especially towards the election, he's going to be really pushing that diversification piece that he's to his credit, worked tremendously hard on.
That's a great point. Any other comments from our panelists today?
I think maybe the other thing worth mentioning, we talked about the throne speech and how much there was in there for the base and social conservatives and stuff like that. The budget didn't feel so much that way. The budget makes me think that they were thinking more towards the election than they were the leadership review. And in particular, there is a long list of funding announcements for Calgary, and there's a short list for Edmonton. And so that tells me that, the government's thinking about the base, but they're also thinking about battleground Calgary. And then the other thing is, and I don't know if anybody is on the line, but I'm thinking about my friends in the not-for-profit sector who always do such a great job analyzing the budget. It takes them a couple of days, but that's the other thing I just want to talk about is we're talking about healthcare and education, but there's so many other societal pressures that we have dealt with through COVID. And so I'm really interested to see what my friends in the not-for-profit sector, come back and tell us about funding for the disadvantaged and, the opioid crisis and all of those things that have just been knocked off the headlines. But those sector that not-for-profit sector has been slammed so hard, and such a big burden will fall on them when it comes to economic recovery.
Thanks very much, Janet. Appreciate that. Well, if there's nothing further, we don't want to take up people's time here. Thanks to all of you for participating today, especially you, Janet. We appreciate you coming and offering your sort of expert insights. Janet Brown of Janet Brown Opinion Research, Sonia Kant of New West Public Affairs, Matt Solberg of New West, and of course, Keith McLaughlin. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And a special shout out to Sarah Payne-Shaw, who is our, if I could put it this way, our executive producer, who helped us bring everything together. Sarah, thanks so much. With that, thanks all of you who joined us today, and we look forward to coming back again in the not too distant future on another issue. Maybe it'll be around April 9th, who knows? Thanks so much, and have a terrific day. Bye now.